Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today's episode is inspired by you, our amazing listeners. You suggest a topic or a book, and we dive deep to bring you valuable insights.
Yeah, we love getting those suggestions.
So let's get started. Today, we're tackling one that keeps popping up, Niccolò Machiavelli's The Prince.
Yes. A classic.
Now, don't worry, we're not expecting you to become 16th century political theorists overnight. Our aim is really just to pull out the core ideas about power and leadership that still resonate today.
Definitely, without getting totally bogged down in, centuries of commentary.
Exactly. So let's start at the beginning, The Prince.
Written by Niccolò Machiavelli way back in 1513. And it really comes out of his own experience. I mean, he was right in the thick of it in Renaissance Italy.
Which was a pretty turbulent time, right?
Oh, absolutely. Constant political maneuvering. Plus, he was a serious student of ancient history. So the book's this blend of real-world observation and historical study. It's short, but potent.
Potent is a good word. So who was this Machiavelli guy? Born in Florence, 1469.
Yep. And his background's interesting. His father was a lawyer, apparently had good connections, but they weren't wealthy.
So Machiavelli had to kind of make his own way, climb the ladder on merit.
Seems that way. And his father's interest in Roman historians, that definitely rubbed off on him, shaped his thinking quite a bit.
And you mentioned the context, Italy back then, late 15th, early 16th century. What was the vibe?
Think political instability on steroids. Shifting alliances, city-states vying for power, figures like Savonarola shaking things up in Florence.
Right, the fiery preacher.
Exactly. And you had foreign powers, France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire constantly intervening. It was this messy, high-stakes environment. That's the world Machiavelli observed.
And The Prince caused quite a stir, didn't it? Not just because the advice was, let's say, unconventional.
Right, although some of it still raises eyebrows today. But yeah, part of the shock was the structure itself. He tried to categorize different kinds of states, republics, monarchies, and then lay out these universal rules for how to gain and keep power.
Almost like a science of statecraft.
Kind of. And that led him to argue that rulers sometimes have to act outside traditional morality. To preserve the state, you might need to do things that wouldn't be okay in private life.
And his bet was that if you succeed, people won't really care how you did it.
Pretty much. Success justifies the means in a political sense. He figured public opinion forgives a winner, especially if they bring stability. The rules are just different for rulers.
And this wasn't just theory for him. He had practical experience, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. After Savonarola's downfall in Florence, Machiavelli held some important posts. Secretary to the Second Chancery, involved with the Ten of War.
So diplomacy, military stuff.
Exactly. Foreign relations, organizing defenses. He saw how the sausage was made, so to speak. That experience gives the prince its hard-nosed practical edge.
And he dedicated the book to the Medici, the ruling family in Florence at the time.
Initially to Giuliano, then later Lorenzo de' Medici. It wasn't just an abstract treatise. It seems he was genuinely hoping a strong leader, maybe one of them, could finally unify Italy and kick out the foreign occupiers. There's a real patriotic plea at the end.
Okay, so our mission today is to dig into those key insights about power, leadership, statecraft, drawing on his examples and his very direct advice.
Let's do it. Where should we start? He begins by classifying states, doesn't he?
Yeah, he breaks it down. Republics and monarchies. And then monarchies can be hereditary or new.
Right. And the new ones are the tricky ones, either totally new or territories you add onto your existing state, what he calls mixed monarchies.
And he says these new or mixed monarchies are inherently unstable at first. Why?
Well, think about it. When you take over, you inevitably upset the people who were loyal to the old regime. That's obvious.
Sure, you make enemies.
But here's the kicker. You also can't fully satisfy the people who helped you get power. Their expectations are always sky high, right? They think things will drastically improve overnight.
And when they don't?
They get disillusioned. So you've got enemies you created and lukewarm friends who feel let down. It's a tough spot.
He uses Louis XII in Milan as an example,
Yeah.
right? Welcomed at first, then quickly kicked out.
Exactly. The Milanese hopes weren't met, and boom, they turned against him. So how do you handle these mixed monarchies then? What are his strategies?
Okay, strategy one, the ruler should actually go and live there.
Yeah, boots on the ground. Why? Because it allows you to see problems developing firsthand and nip them in the bud.
Makes sense. Prevents things from spiraling.
Right, and it stops your officials from bleeding the place dry. People appreciate having direct access to the ruler. He points to the Ottoman Sultan controlling Greece this way. It shows commitment, provides stability.
Like 16th century management by walking around?
While sending colonists, he argues this is way better than stationing lots of troops.
Why colonies?
Well, they're cheaper, for one, and they only displace a small number of locals, the ones whose land you give to the colonists. These displaced people are usually poor and scattered, so they're less of a threat.
Whereas a big army
costs a fortune, annoys everyone because they have to quarter them, and breeds resentment. The Romans used colonies effectively in their provinces, he notes.
Smart. And managing the neighbors.
Crucial. Keep the nearby powers in check. He again praises the Romans in Greece. They supported the weaker states to keep them friendly but dependent, while actively undermining the stronger ones. And critically, they prevented any other major foreign power from gaining influence. It's all about managing the local balance of power to your advantage.
Foresight seems huge for Machiavelli, dealing with problems before they blow up.
Absolutely critical. He uses this medical analogy about tuberculosis, I think.
Yeah, consumption, he calls it.
Right. In the early stages, it's hard to spot, but easy to cure. Later on, it's easy to diagnose, but almost impossible to fix. Political problems are the same.
Spot them early, act decisively.
Exactly. The Romans, he says, never shied away from a necessary war just to postpone it. They knew delaying often just makes the problem worse and strengthens the enemy. Proactive, not reactive.
That's a really powerful point. Okay, so he uses another historical example. The kingdom of Darius, after Alexander the Great conquered it, why didn't it just fall apart when Alexander died?
Ah, yes. This gets into the structure of governments. Machiavelli says it depends on how the monarchy is set up.
Two types, right?
Basically, yeah. Type 1. The king rules with ministers who are essentially his servants, totally dependent on him. Think the Ottoman Sultan. All power flows from the top.
Okay.
Type 2. The king rules, but alongside powerful barons or nobles who have their own hereditary lands, titles, and loyal followers. Think feudal France at the time.
So Darius's kingdom was like the first type, the Turkish model.
Exactly. Once Alexander defeated Darius and took out the central authority, there were no other independent power centers left to cause trouble. The ministers owed Alexander's successors allegiance just as they had Darius. Controlling it was, relatively speaking, easier. The main fights were among Alexander's generals themselves.
Whereas in places like France, those powerful nobles are always potential rivals or rebels.
Precisely. That's why, Machiavelli argues, conquering and holding on to places like Gaul, Spain, or Greece was so much harder for the Romans. These places had lots of local princes and established loyalties.
It took Rome a long time to really stamp out those local power structures.
Right. Only after those local hierarchies were dismantled did the areas become truly secure Roman provinces. So the structure of the state you conquer matters just as much as your military skill.
Fascinating. Now, what if you conquer a city or state that used to govern itself? A republic, basically.
Yeah.
His advice here sounds pretty grim.
Yeah, he doesn't mince words. When dealing with places used to freedom, he gives 3 options. 1, destroy them completely.
Ooh.
2, go live there yourself. We talked about that. 3, let them keep their own laws, set up a friendly local government that depends on you, and make them pay tribute.
But he really leans into that first option, destruction, especially for cities with a strong tradition of liberty. Why so drastic?
Because, he argues, the memory of freedom never dies. He says if you conquer a free city and don't ruin it, you should expect it to ruin you. They'll always seize the first chance to rebel, fueled by the name of liberty in their old ways.
Even after a long time.
Doesn't matter. He points to Pisa rebelling against Florence after 100 years. That desire for freedom, that memory, is just too powerful, too dangerous to leave intact in a conquered republic.
Wow, okay. And what about places used to being ruled by a prince already?
Much easier, in his view. Once you eliminate the ruling family, the people are used to obeying someone. They don't have that ingrained tradition of self-government or obvious leaders to rally around. You can win them over more easily.
So republics are the real challenge because of that spirit of liberty.
Exactly. They have more life, he says, more hatred for the conqueror, more desire for revenge. For them, it's either destruction or constant vigilance through personal rule.
Okay, let's switch gears. How does a new ruler actually get power? He talks about rising through your own abilities versus just getting lucky.
Right. Ability versus fortune, or virtue versus fortuna, are his terms. And how you get power really affects how easy it is to keep it.
So who has the easier time staying in charge? The one who fought their way up?
Generally, yes. Those who rely less on luck and more on their own virtue, their skill, courage, cunning, tend to build a more solid foundation and last longer. Though, he notes, getting there is harder work.
What makes it harder for the self-made ruler initially?
The biggest hurdle is introducing new laws and systems. You need to change things to secure your rule, right?
Naturally.
But doing that creates instant enemies, everyone who benefited from the old system, and the people who might benefit from your new system. They're often hesitant, unsure, offering only lukewarm support.
Because change is scary, and the old guard fights hard.
Exactly. Your opponents are passionate and organized. Your potential supporters are cautious. It's a dangerous imbalance, especially early on.
So what about the lucky ones? The rulers who get power through good fortune or someone else's help, like inheriting it unexpectedly or being installed by a powerful ally?
Their challenge is flipped. Getting power might have been relatively easy, but keeping it requires massive effort because they haven't built the foundations themselves.
They start on shaky ground.
Very shaky. He uses the famous contrast between Francesco Sforza and Cesare Borgia. Sforza, a brilliant mercenary captain, fought hard to become Duke of Milan using his own virtue. It was tough, but once he got there, he held it quite firmly.
Okay, and Borgia?
Cesare Borgia got his power base primarily because his father was Pope Alexander VI. Massive dose of fortune there. He was incredibly ruthless and capable, and Machiavelli actually admires his methods for trying to consolidate power.
Trying to build those foundations after the fact.
Exactly. Borgia did everything right, according to Machiavelli, to secure himself, crushing enemies, building loyalty, creating his own army. But when his father died suddenly, and Borgia himself got seriously ill at the same time, pure bad luck, Fortuna, his whole enterprise collapsed.
So even with great ability, bad luck can undo you if your power wasn't built on your own solid foundations from the start.
That's the core lesson. If you get power through luck, you need exceptional virtue to quickly build the necessary supports, and even then, it's risky. Borgia is his model for how to try and do that, even though he ultimately failed due to misfortune.
This leads right into assessing a state's strength, particularly its military. Machiavelli has very strong views on armies.
Oh, definitely. First, he distinguishes rulers who can stand on their own feet militarily from those who have to hide behind city walls and rely on others.
Self-reliance is key.
Absolutely. But how you achieve that military strength is crucial, and this is where he gets really fired up about mercenaries and auxiliary troops.
He basically says they're useless and dangerous, right?
That's putting it mildly. He paints this picture of mercenaries as being ambitious but undisciplined, disloyal, brave amongst themselves but cowardly against a real enemy. No fear of God, no loyalty to who's paying them.
Why so negative?
Because their only motivation is money. They'll plunder you in peacetime with their high fees, and in wartime, they'll either run away, demand more money, or even turn against you if a better offer comes along. Relying on them is just inviting disaster.
And he backs this up with history.
Constantly. Carthage's struggles, Thebes hiring Philip of Macedon, who then took over, Sforza turning on Milan, Florence's issues with commanders like Vitelli, Venice's catastrophic defeat at Vaila after relying on mercenary captains.
He really piles on the examples.
He does. He even blames the fall of the Roman Empire in part on their increasing use of Gothic mercenaries, arguing it weakened their own military spirit and empowered their future destroyers.
So if mercenaries and auxiliaries troops borrowed from an ally, which he says are even worse, are out, what's the answer?
Your own army. An army made up of your subjects, your citizens, people directly dependent on you, people fighting for their own homes, their own state, under your command.
Like the citizen soldiers of Rome or Sparta.
Exactly. Or the Swiss, in his own time, fiercely independent and well-armed because they relied on themselves. He criticizes France for becoming dependent on Swiss mercenaries after King Charles VII had started building a proper national army. Reliance on others just makes you weak.
His bottom line is pretty clear then.
Absolutely unambiguous. No state is secure without its own loyal army. Period.
Okay, so if having your own army is crucial, what's the ruler's personal role regarding the military?
It should be their absolute #1 priority. War. It's organization, military discipline that's the ruler's main job, according to Machiavelli.
More important than anything else.
He argues it's the only skill that truly belongs to a ruler. Neglect it and you lose your state. Master it and you can gain and keep power. And this isn't just a wartime focus.
He says you need to prep constantly, even in peacetime. How?
2 ways. Physical and mental.
Yeah.
Physically, keep your troops trained, yes, but also the ruler personally needs to understand the terrain.
Like map reading.
More than that, hunting, exploring your lands, getting a feel for the mountains, rivers, swamps. Knowing the landscape intimately is vital for defense, for planning campaigns, choosing campsites, everything. He says a commander who doesn't know the terrain lacks the first quality needed.
Okay, so know your territory. What about the mental preparation?
Study history. Read about great military leaders, how they won, why they lost. Analyze their strategies. He even suggests picking a role model.
Like who?
Alexander the Great modeled himself on Achilles, Caesar looked to Alexander, Scipio Africanus studied Cyrus the Great. You learn from the best, emulate their actions, understand their decisions, never get complacent, always be thinking about war.
Intense. Okay, let's shift to public perception. What makes a ruler praised or criticized? And that famous question, better to be loved or feared?
Right. Machiavelli acknowledges everyone wants a ruler to have good qualities: compassion, loyalty, honesty, being religious, etc. It would be great, he says, if a ruler could always be like that. But the reality of maintaining a state means sometimes you have to act contrary to those virtues. Need to be willing to be cruel or break your word or act against charity or religion if the security of the state demands it.
So you can't always be the good guy.
Not if you want to stay in power, he argues. What's crucial, though, is appearing to have those virtues. Especially appearing religious, he thinks that's incredibly important for public image.
People judge by appearances.
Overwhelmingly. Most people see the surface, the results. Only a few get close enough to see the real person, and they won't dare challenge the majority view, especially when the ruler is successful. So cultivate the image, even if the reality is flexible.
Which brings us to love versus fear, if you have to choose.
Fear. It's safer to be feared than loved if you can't be both.
Why? That sounds so counterintuitive.
His reasoning is pretty bleak about human nature. People, he says, are generally ungrateful, fickle, liars, cowardly in the face of danger, and greedy. Yeah. So love is held by a bond of obligation, which people, being self-interested, will break whenever it suits them. Fear, however, is maintained by a dread of punishment, and that feeling never goes away. It's a more reliable motivator.
But you don't want to be hated, right? There's a difference between fear and hatred.
Absolutely crucial distinction. Fear is useful. Hatred is dangerous. Hatred breeds conspiracies and rebellion. The key to avoiding hatred is simple. Don't take your subjects' property, and don't mess with their women.
Keep your hands off their stuff and their families.
Basically, yes. Also, be decisive. Project strength and seriousness. Avoid seeming changeable, frivolous, weak, or cowardly. That earns contempt, which is almost as bad as hatred.
He uses the Roman emperors as examples here too, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Trying to keep both the people and the army happy.
Exactly. A tough balancing act. The people generally wanted peace and quiet. The army wanted a warlike emperor, opportunities for glory and loot, and often indulged their own cruelty. Emperors often had to pick a side, usually favoring the army because they needed their support to survive.
And some emperors got it badly wrong.
Oh, yeah. He talks about Commodus being hated for his degeneracy, Pertinax despised for being too strict after Commodus, Alexander Severus seen as effeminate and weak, Maximinus hated for his low birth and cruelty. They failed to manage that balance and ended up assassinated.
But someone like Severus managed it.
Severus, Machiavelli says, was brilliant at being both the cunning fox and the terrifying lion. He knew how to impress the soldiers and keep the people sufficiently awed or intimidated. He navigated the hazards successfully. The main takeaway is avoid being hated by the majority, because that's your best defense against conspiracies. If the people are reasonably content, conspirators lose their nerve.
Makes sense. What about other strategies, like building fortresses? Good idea or bad idea?
It depends. Fortresses can be useful for defense, obviously, but they can also be a liability. Some rulers he mentions, like Niccolò Machiavelli or Guidobaldo, actually tore down fortresses after regaining power, believing they encouraged rebellion or symbolized distrust.
So it's situational. What about disarming people you conquer?
Again, nuanced. If it's a completely new state you're founding, he might suggest arming some subjects. But if you're adding a new province to your existing state, his advice is generally to disarm the locals.
Except maybe the ones who helped you.
Right, but even them you should look to weaken over time. The goal is to concentrate military power in your own loyal forces, ideally troops from your original state. And interestingly, he suggests it's often easier to win over those who are content under the previous ruler than to rely solely on those who helped you take power initially, because their demands might be endless.
Okay, so how does a ruler win genuine respect, not just obedience through fear?
by doing great things, undertaking ambitious enterprises, setting a powerful example. Think grand military campaigns, major building projects, things that capture the public imagination and demonstrate your virtue.
Be impressive. What about alliances?
Be decisive. Machiavelli hates neutrality. He says if two neighbors are fighting, you must pick a side.
Why not stay out of it?
Because if you stay neutral, the winner will see you as weak and untrustworthy, and the loser will resent you for not helping. You lose either way.
Should take a stand.
Yes. Be a true friend or a true enemy. If you back an ally decisively, even if they lose, they'll feel indebted and grateful. And if your side wins, you share in the victory and solidify the alliance. Boldness pays off.
What about the people working closely with the ruler, his ministers or secretaries?
Choosing good advisors is critical. He talks about 3 kinds of minds. Those who understand things on their own, the best kind, but rare. Those who can understand things once explained, very valuable. And those who understand nothing, totally useless.
So ideally, find geniuses, but realistically, find people who can grasp good advice.
Exactly. A ruler who has the second type of mind, who can recognize good advice from bad, even if they don't originate the ideas, can still govern very effectively. The key is choosing ministers who are competent and, crucially, loyal, whose own success is tied to yours.
Now, near the end, Machiavelli turns his gaze back to Italy and asks why its rulers kept losing their states in his time. What's his diagnosis?
It's not just bad luck, he insists. It's their own failures. Primarily a lack of foresight. They didn't prepare for trouble when times were good.
Coasting during peacetime.
Right. And then, when crisis hit, their first instinct was often to run away, hoping the people would call them back or that some foreign power would rescue them.
Which he sees as a terrible strategy.
The worst. Relying on others, whether your own disgruntled populace or foreign armies, is weak. True defense, lasting security, comes only from your own strength, your own resources, your own virtue.
Which brings us to that final big theme, the role of luck, or fortuna, in all this. How much control does a ruler really have?
He acknowledges that many people believe fate and God control everything, leaving little room for free will. And he agrees, fortune is powerful. Maybe it governs half our actions, he concedes.
But only half.
But the other half, or maybe nearly half, he argues, is up to us. Success depends on adapting your actions to the specific circumstances, to the times.
So flexibility is key.
Immensely. The ruler who succeeds is the one whose approach matches the needs of the moment. Sometimes caution works, sometimes boldness, sometimes patience, sometimes force. The problem is, people find it hard to change their basic character or methods.
So a cautious ruler might fail when boldness is needed, and vice versa.
Exactly. Your fortune changes based on whether your ingrained style happens to align with what the situation demands. And because circumstances are always shifting, it's hard to stay successful unless you can adapt.
But he does offer a concluding thought on how to deal with fortune.
Yes, despite the difficulty of adapting, he makes a final, quite famous assertion. He says, since fortune is unpredictable and favors change,
it's better to be impulsive than cautious.
Pretty much. He says fortune is female, and to master her, you need to be bold, aggressive, forceful. She yields more readily to the impetuous than the overly careful. Go for it, basically.
Wow. And then he ends the book with that direct appeal, doesn't he?
A really passionate call to action. He looks at Italy divided, conquered, oppressed, and says the time is ripe. The conditions are perfect for a new, strong, virtuous leader to rise up.
Like a Moses for Italy.
He makes exactly those comparisons. Moses leading the Israelites, Cyrus founding Persia, Theseus uniting Athens. Great leaders emerge when their people are at their lowest point. Italy's suffering, he argues, presents a historic opportunity for someone to gain immense honor by liberating and uniting the country.
So the Prince isn't just a cold analysis. It ends with this fiery, patriotic plea.
Absolutely. It's a call for a redeemer for Italy.
Okay, so wrapping up our deep dive today, we've seen Machiavelli's, let's call it pragmatic, maybe even cynical view on gaining and keeping power. It's a mix of history, observation, and some pretty startling advice.
Definitely startling. Things like preferring fear over love, the absolute necessity of your own army, the idea that rulers operate by different ethical rules. It's designed to make you think, even if you disagree.
And while it's from the 16th century, you can definitely see people drawing parallels to leadership and power dynamics today. We'll leave those specific connections for our listeners to ponder, of course.
Which leads to that final thought. Where is the balance today between being virtuous and being effective as a leader? How much of Machiavelli's world still applies? What does fortune look like for leaders now, and how can they best try to, as he put it, master it?
Really fascinating questions to chew on. We definitely encourage everyone to check out The Prince if you haven't already, and let us know your thoughts. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.